Welcome to my channel, where ancient memories are retold like prophecy. Here, we're not just reading history from a book. We're digging deeper, back to a time before time had a name, into memories sealed in stone, in water, in human blood. The series, Atlantis Sealed Memory, will take you back to a forgotten age, before floods wiped cities from the map, before language splintered, before humanity forgot who it really was. This isn't a story about a lost city. It's a journey to break open the vibrational seals the gods put in place to lock the truth away. On this journey, we'll follow Enki, the god known as the bringer of light, as he hears the call from the deep sea. That call isn't sound, it's memory. It's an accusation. It's the truth that refuses to stay buried forever. If you're ready, step with me through that dark, watery gate, to reclaim what they wanted you to forget, to remember what Atlantis never did. Subscribe so you don't miss any episode in this quest to unseal memory. And if you're listening, drop a comment with the number 8, the symbol of infinity, of the never-ending cycle of memory. Enki lay there, eyes shut but sleepless. The night was silent, but in his head there was a low, cracked voice like breaking stone. A wordless song, just vibration, deep and cold, cutting through every divine defense in his mind. It didn't just whisper, it roared, calling his true name, that ancient name even the gods had forgotten out of fear. Atlantis, not just a lost city, a wound, a memory sealed away, a soul buried alive on the ocean floor. And tonight, it stirred, clawing through the silence to be heard, to be answered. In his dream, he stood before a pitch-black ocean with no shore, no wind, no stars, just a thick, inky expanse, heavy like unconfessed sin. Enki felt the pressure tighten on his chest, each wave sinking with his heartbeat. He couldn't tell where his blood ended, and the sea began. Atlantis wasn't dead, it was waiting. And now, it was awake. It emerged in the water like a ghost city. An eerie blue glow lit up cracked crystal towers rising like dead coral. Stone walls exhaled me symbols, flickering like cold will-o'-the-wisps. Alive, but chilling. Water seeped through fractures, like blood from an old unhealed wound. No, not just water. Tears. Atlantis was crying, crying for being abandoned, crying for the betrayal. A mournful echo, like a funeral horn, rumbled from fractured stone. You abandoned me. Enki wanted to scream, I was protecting you. But the words caught in his throat, because he knew it was a lie. He hadn't protected it. He had sealed it, locked away knowledge that could save or doom the world. Because he didn't trust humanity, and he didn't trust himself. He reached out to touch it but felt only cold, nothing to hold on to, just water. Or more precisely, liquid memory coiling around his wrist like chains. In that darkness, a massive eye opened. It didn't see with light but with sound, reading every lie. The Emmy tablets deep in Atlantis beat in sync with his heart like co-conspirators. Atlantis hadn't forgotten. Atlantis never forgot. A voice, rough as cracking stone, rose from the ocean's depths. Are you afraid of your own design? Enki trembled. No defense, because this dream wasn't asking to hear him. It was demanding a confession. Atlantis didn't want excuses. It wanted the truth. And in the dark, Enki understood. No seal lasts forever. And this call wouldn't stop, not until he returned. Enki wanted to get up, to claw his way out of this dream thick as wet mud. But he couldn't. The call of Atlantis clung to his thoughts like claws. It wasn't a song anymore. It was a grim command, booming up from the ocean's heart and rattling his spine. Don't turn away. The voice had no mouth to speak with, but it poured straight into Enki's veins. It delivered a cold that wasn't just temperature, but memory frozen solid. Then Enki felt himself being pulled down, not falling freely, but dragged slowly through water thick as oil, black and murky. Every time he struggled, it tightened, like a living thing coiling around him. It whispered in low frequencies, old curses of his own making turning on him. There was nowhere left to hide, nothing left to forget. He sank into the first layer. There, time didn't exist, only memory that lived like blood. Enki saw himself younger, a god blazing with pride, eyes bright like distant stars. He and his brothers descending from the heavens, bringing the language of the Me, the laws of the cosmos. But that same gaze now looked back at him with contempt. You forgot we were born to guard, not to rule. The voice came from his past self, condemning him in the present. Atlantis forced him to look. The seafloor opened up like a living screen. The Anunnaki Council in session. Hands carving decrees. Enlil's voice cracked like thunder. These creatures are too noisy. Cull them. And he, Enki, silent, not agreeing, but not stopping it. That memory drowned him in shame. He had once dreamed of saving them, but the dream shattered in the cold slap of water. The water squeezed tighter, pulling him deeper. It wasn't liquid anymore. It was sludge made of memory. Choking like old sin, Atlantis whispered like a mother lulling her child. But the lullabies were blades. Look. Remember. He saw flickering images. Humans bound and whipped to build cities for gods. Me tablets handed to rulers to turn knowledge into chains. Enki watched his own hand offering them, not as weapons, as solutions, but they became shackles. You taught them to read, so they could sign their own slavery. Atlantis roared. He had nothing to say. All his justifications shattered. The water shook violently. A giant eye opened in the dark. Then hundreds, thousands, each one a memory Enki wanted to forget. Watching him, judging. You sealed me away out of fear. Atlantis's voice wasn't singular anymore. It was a choir of accusation. You feared this knowledge would burn everything, even you. And he screamed underwater, I only wanted to protect them. His words broke into bubbles, dissolving into nothing. Atlantis didn't believe him. The water twisted into the shapes of guardians. Naga with silver scales and eyes like black holes. Apkallu with wings etched in Me symbols. They formed a circle, water rising like mist, turning ritualistic. They didn't bow to Enki, they bowed to Atlantis. He's here to pay the price. Atlantis commanded, open the gate, return the memory. Enki saw the gate, a living spiral, black with a blue glow shining from within. It pulsed at a frequency only he could hear. Each coil was a memory he'd sealed away, a promise. A sin, a broken vow. It beckoned, but also threatened. Atlantis laughed in the water. You think hiding this would save them? It showed him the future. Others, Enlil, Inanna, Marduk, trying to break the seal. Humans dredging the ocean floor for knowledge that wasn't theirs, turning it into weapons, turning me tablets into tools of mind control, blood spilled on engraved stone, screams cracking through water. Enki sobbed. The salt of the sea and the salt of tears were the same. He understood. He was the key. The seal only existed because he maintained it. Atlantis wasn't dead. It waited for him to weaken, waited for him to be afraid, and he was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if it opened. Afraid of what would happen if it didn't. Atlantis roared again, water exploding into sonic waves. Return the memory. The eye slammed shut. Everything went black. But the echo remained, twisting like a blade in Enki's mind. You will come back. You can't forget. He jerked awake, body drenched in cold sweat, heart hammering wildly. But the silence was gone. The call of Atlantis was still there. A low, unending frequency thrumming in his blood, in his bones, in his soul. It had planted its seed, and Enki knew, even as dawn broke, the darkness remained. The journey back had begun, and there was no way out. Enki lurched upright, lungs burning like he'd just escaped drowning in the surf. No more black water squeezing him, just a damp, dim stone room. But he was soaked in sweat, salty on his lips like seawater. The first light of day slipped through the door crack, thin and yellowed like an old memory. Enki sat frozen, head bowed, back curved, as if trying to fold himself away from the sound. But the call was still there. No longer the deep rumble of water, but a steady, dull roar in his blood. A rhythm his heart couldn't silence. He pressed a hand to his chest like he could tear it out. But what lay beneath? The ME tablets etched in memory. Ancient laws and languages carved straight into his soul. Enki shivered, not from cold, but from truth. Atlantis was never just a place. It was a pact, a vow written in vibration. And now it was collecting on that promise. His vision blurred. In the dim light, he saw moss-covered stone pillars inscribed with living glyphs. Each line squirmed like silver worms across the rock. He remembered every carve, every syllable. He'd written them himself, bargained with the deep, forged the seal. And now the characters wouldn't stay silent. They trembled, whispering weak but relentless accusations like a chanting curse. You thought you had the right to lock us away. Enki closed his eyes, but the voice kept sounding inside. He moved, heavy as if dragging iron chains. The floor was cold and slick beneath his feet. He left the room, walking down a dark corridor where the sun couldn't reach. But everywhere he went, water dripped. Each drop sounded like a ticking clock. How long before humans find me? Enki walked faster, but the voice stayed with him, not in his ears, but in his skull. He ducked into a small chamber filled with broken ME tablets, cracked stone shards. Their glyphs faded, but unvanished. He fell to his knees, hand landing on one fragment. A cold shot up his spine. The glyphs glowed like embers under ash, and Atlantis' voice flooded his head. You promised to protect. Images crashed through his mind. Humans with terror in their eyes as floodwaters rose. Screams, pleading, and Enki, standing on a high rock, vision blurred with rain and tears, silent. He had saved a few, Atrahasis and his family. But the rest? Atlantis remembered. Atlantis played it back like a ritual of blame. You promised you'd come back. He clenched the shard so hard its edge cut his skin. Blood dripped onto the stone, soaking into the glyphs. The tablet quivered, drinking his blood like renewing an ancient pact. Enki gagged, wanting to drop it, but his hand wouldn't let go. The sound of water grew louder. He spun. In the dark hall, water seeped from cracks, pooling on the floor. And in that pool, he saw it. Atlantis, submerged in black ocean, eyes wide open. Eyes that didn't reflect light, but emitted it. That gaze pierced water, time, every seal ever made. You fear the truth. He stumbled back against the wall. Cold as a tombstone, Atlantis pressed on. You don't trust them. You don't trust yourself. You buried me so they wouldn't have to grow up. The vision twisted. Water roiled into shapes, naga coiling, scales glinting with glyph light. They stared unblinking. The water's weight was gone, but their gaze was an anchor around his neck. Apkallu appeared behind them, wings inscribed with me symbols glowing dimly. They formed a circle, a tribunal, a ritual of judgment. He carries the seal in his blood. He is the key. He must open it. Atlantis no longer whispered. It roared in the voice of a raging sea. The room shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Enki squeezed his eyes shut, wanting to scream the sound away. But his throat locked, choked with mud-thick terror. When he opened his eyes, everything was quiet, but not peaceful. Just the hush before the storm. Enki panted, staring at his hands. Blood dried black along the glyph lines. He whispered, "I don't want to." Atlantis answered, "What you want doesn't matter anymore." Outside, wind howled through rock crevices. But to Enki, it was the sound of water. Waves smashing rock, eroding memory. He stepped out of the room, eyes vacant. Under his feet, broken AE tablets crunched like brittle bones. But the glyphs still lived. They crawled across the stone floor, glowing blue, like Atlantis's blood flowing back toward him. He knew he couldn't deny it anymore. Couldn't call it a dream. Atlantis was in his blood, his breath, his heart. The call had no night or day, no water or earth, only truth. And truth demanded payment. Enki raised his head. Ahead was a narrow path leading out onto a cliff over the sea. Waves crashed violently below, white spray like animal fangs. But to him, it wasn't an ocean. It was Atlantis's mouth, open, waiting for his return. And he knew. No matter where he went, it would keep calling. Not with words, but with memory. Not with threats, but with the guilt he couldn't wash away. And in the end, he'd have to answer. He'd have to go back to that deep place and open what he'd once sealed with blood and fear. Because Atlantis wasn't dead. Atlantis remembered. Atlantis waited. And Enki, the one who created it, who betrayed it, would have to face what was never sealed in stone or water, but in his own soul. Enki stepped out of the dark cave, breath heavy like he was hauling hell itself in his chest. Ahead of him loomed the sheer cliff, falling away into a boundless sea. Cold wind slapped his face, thick with the raw salt of ocean and time. Waves crashed against the rocks below, sending up white spray like a pack of wild animals howling in the night. But Enki didn't hear the waves. He only heard a voice, low, deep, resonant as the sea itself. "I'm waiting for you." He squinted at the water, breaking into silver shards under the dull grey dawn. But in his mind, it didn't reflect the sky. It was bottomless, dense as blood, and in it, Atlantis stirred. A city twisting in shadow, crystal towers split and leaking eerie blue light. ME glyphs slithered like living snakes across stone walls, whispering ancient words humans no longer understood. But he did, because it was his language. Atlantis didn't call him by any glorious name, not Enki, the bringer of light. It called him the sealer, the betrayer, and he couldn't argue. In the sea wind, he heard its dry laugh, a sound not of a city, but of a soul burned black by millennia of rage. "You thought burying me deep would be enough? The waves still sing, the rocks still remember, and blood still hears." Enki took a step back, heel grinding into damp, sandy earth. He wanted to cover his ears, to shut his eyes. But he'd tried that. In darkness, closing his eyes, only summoned Atlantis. In silence, plugging his ears only amplified its voice. Because it wasn't sound, it was memory. And you can't seal off memory. You can't silence an oath. He swallowed hard, throat dry as ash. Atlantis didn't stop. It forced him to look, through his own eyes, not water. Images slammed into him, his hand pressed against damp stone in the cave, touching meglyphs, pulsing like a heartbeat. His voice from memory. "I swear to keep it safe. No one will turn it into a weapon." Atlantis echoed those words back at him, hammering them into his skull. No one, no ruler, no rebel, no self-made god. He trembled, nails biting into his palms until blood welled. Waves smashed below the cliff. But to Enki, it was the pounding of sealed memories demanding to be let out. Atlantis's whisper was slow, heavy as boulders. "You broke your vow. You gave me to rulers. You taught them letters to sign slave pacts. You promised to guard it. You promised to return if it called." Wind howled through his hair, cold to the bone. But colder still was his shame. Atlantis didn't need to scream. Truth was enough. Enki searched for some defense, but his throat only produced ragged breathing. He'd thought burying this knowledge was mercy. But he hadn't just buried it, he buried his responsibility. Atlantis remembered. Atlantis hadn't forgiven. The sea surged, slamming waves against the rock, spraying his legs. He staggered, but didn't fall. Atlantis laughed deep in the water, voice old and hungry. "I know why you're afraid. You fear humans finding me. Fear them, wielding me without understanding. Fear them, turning memory into chains, oaths into weapons." Enki squinted as visions flooded his head. A town burning in the night, firelight flickering over me-carved columns. A robed figure, chanting glyphs like spells. People cowering in fear. Atlantis didn't just remember the past. It saw the future. Atlantis didn't forgive because Atlantis knew. He clenched his teeth. Wind roared. Waves roared. Atlantis roared. And he roared back in silence. "I don't want this," Atlantis replied, voice warm and biting like poisoned wine. "Not wanting won't save you." Waves smashed again, and Enki saw shapes in them, Naga with shimmering blue scales, Apkallu standing in the surf, wings dripping me-glyphs, eyes burning like torches in the dark. They guarded Atlantis's gate, and they watched him. No hatred, no fear, only certainty. "You are the key." Atlantis delivered the verdict, final and absolute. Enki lowered his head, nothing left to argue. Inside, he felt hollow as an abandoned vault, once filled with vows, now reduced to echoes. Atlantis waited. Atlantis called. And he knew the journey back to the deepest waters wasn't an if anymore. It was only when. Enki stood frozen, eyes open, staring at the sea. But he no longer saw waves. All he saw was a dense black whirlpool, a bottomless pit opening from inside his own mind. The wind howled in his ears like a cold chorus of Atlantis's endless accusations. He couldn't tell the difference anymore between the sound of water and the rush of blood in his veins. They both carried the same heavy rhythm of memories refusing to sleep. He inhaled deeply, but the cold air stabbed his lungs like needles. Enki shut his eyes, trying to force everything into silence. But Atlantis didn't need sound to speak. In the quiet, it spoke even clearer, a slow, deep voice, unhurried, like the words of a god that couldn't be denied. "You're still holding what belongs to me." Enki shivered. Not from the wind, but from the truth that voice was peeling out of him. He'd once believed he could bury Atlantis with vibrating seals, hide it in the pulse of waves and the lines of the glyphs. But he was the one who'd placed it at the bottom. And to do that, he'd given up a part of himself. The softest part. The truest part. Atlantis hadn't forgotten. Atlantis wanted the rest. He lowered his head, hands clenching into fists so tight, his nails bit into his palms. Atlantis waited. It didn't shout, didn't force. It knew he would confess on his own. And he did, voice hoarse. "Back then, I left a promise behind." The wind whipped his hair back. Atlantis listened in silence, like an ancient priest listening to a penitent's confession. Enki didn't see it with his eyes but felt it in his bones. That old memory, standing before Atlantis's open gate. Water swirling like living fog. Blue light flickering over me tablets, arranged in an arch. Their glyphs singing a low, mournful hymn. To close that gate, he hadn't just spoken spells. He'd poured part of his own memory into it. Compassion, regret, a piece of his soul, admitting knowledge had to be sealed because humanity wasn't ready. Atlantis's voice cracked like thawing ice. "I don't want a part. I want all of it." Enki exhaled sharply, breath fogging before his eyes. He realized his hands were shaking violently. Atlantis didn't want to be hidden anymore. It refused half measures. If he wanted to seal it again, he'd have to cut deeper, strip himself bare, surrender every memory, every fear, every reason he'd ever chosen to lock it away. Atlantis didn't just want his promise, it demanded his sacrifice. Waves pounded below the cliff, their boom like war drums. But in Enki's ears, it was his own heartbeat, terrified, but unable to deny. He felt a pain unlike any on his skin. It was deeper, like someone taking a blade to his memories. Atlantis whispered, "You made me a prison for memory. Now you have to become the door." Enki lifted his face. Cold dawn light fell into his eyes, offering no warmth. Tears streamed back across his cheeks, stinging like salt. Inside, a weak voice protested, "No, I've given enough." Atlantis answered immediately, like a god who doesn't negotiate. "You haven't given everything." Images flooded him. Humans laughing, crying, killing, building towers, writing pacts. He saw blood mixing with clay to form the first body. Saw himself beside Ninhursag, their hands slick with blood and earth. Saw Enlil's fiery stare, branding him a rebel. And over it all, heard his own oath, that he'd guard this knowledge so it would never become a shackle. Atlantis roared, "But you let it become chains." Enki collapsed, forehead pressing into the cold, damp ground. His breathing was ragged, filled with the salt of tears and the sea. His fingers dug into the sand and rock, feeling glyphs under the surface, like arteries, memories' lifeblood flowing through the earth itself. Atlantis fell silent for a moment, not out of mercy, but to let him understand. And he did. To keep Atlantis sealed, he would have to become the seal. No more half-truths. No more carving out only the parts he hated. Atlantis wanted it all. And he knew there were only two choices left: open the gate to humanity, or give up every piece of himself to lock it away forever. Wind screamed across the cliff. Waves battered the rock, spraying white foam like bared teeth. And Enki, the one they once called the bringer of light, knelt there, trembling, eyes wide open, staring into the black sea, as if staring into his own soul, and realizing it had no bottom. Enki knelt there for a long time, his shoulders shuddering, with breaths heavy as the waves pounding below the cliff. The pale morning light swept across the sea, making the spray glint like shattered pearls. But he didn't see the beauty. To him, it was only a reminder that anything could be swallowed whole in a single tide. Atlantis was silent, but its silence was thick as mud, pressing against his chest so he could barely breathe. Finally, Enki planted his hands in sand and dried blood and pushed himself up. His legs trembled, but he forced them to move. Each step crunched over grit and the buried bones of memory. He turned his back on the sea, walking deeper into the dark of the cave. In his head, the voice didn't stop. It didn't roar, didn't laugh anymore. It just whispered in a steady, hypnotic refrain, "Give it all back." Enki clenched his jaw. His breath rasped with cold and fear. Atlantis didn't just want a promise. It wanted the flesh and blood of his soul. He could almost feel its invisible hand sliding into his chest, squeezing his heart. He tried bargaining with it, like an equal god. "Give me time." A thin, blade-like laugh echoed in his skull. Atlantis wasn't in a hurry. It had waited this long. It wasn't afraid to wait longer. But it didn't forget. He pressed deeper into the narrowing cave, moisture dripping like tears from the ceiling. The air was heavy with the rotting green scent of moss and wet stone, like incense in a long-abandoned temple. Enki set his hand on the wall, feeling the Emi glyphs worn by centuries, but not dead. Their lines were like coagulated veins still pulsing faintly. Atlantis whispered from those carvings. We remember. He ground his teeth, nails scraping red marks into the stone. Images flooded in uninvited. Him and Ninhursag standing over a stone table, mixing clay and blood. Her hands shaking as she molded the first human shape. His hand on her shoulder, eyes fierce yet full of dread. He'd wanted to give them wisdom, freedom. But what was the cost of freedom? Atlantis showed it to him in brutal clarity. The cost was learning war, learning lies, learning to turn me into chains. You sowed freedom as a promise, but planted shackles in their blood. Atlantis muttered, like a priest reading out sins. Enki staggered. He flung out a hand as if to swipe it away, but found only freezing air. His voice cracked, ragged. I can't. I don't want to remember it all. Atlantis didn't laugh this time. It went quiet, heavy as a tomb, and in that silence he heard it clearer than ever. There is no seal that lasts forever. He shook his head, but the memories wouldn't let go. He saw lines of people hauling stones to build cities. Emi glyphs on tablets weren't liberating knowledge anymore. They were commands. Children learning to read not to understand, but to obey. Words carved on city gates that no longer promised knowledge, but demanded submission. Enter and serve. Atlantis wouldn't let him look away. It forced him to watch. He collapsed, panting, palms smacking cold stone. Water trickled down a crack nearby, the small sound booming like thunder in his ears. Atlantis whispered, I don't want your apology. I want memory. All of it. Enki lifted his face, sweat and tears mingling cold on his skin. In the darkness, the Emi glyphs on the walls glowed faint blue, like eyes blinking open, seeing right through him to the bone. He understood. Atlantis couldn't be tricked or lulled to sleep. It was living truth. It refused to be sealed unless the one sealing it offered all of himself as sacrifice. Outside, the wind howled past the cave mouth like the shriek of a dying world. But in here, it was so silent he could hear his heart beating slow, tired, but refusing to stop. Enki closed his eyes, not to hide this time, but to accept. Atlantis didn't wait long. It slid into his ear, soft as a blade across the throat. You will return, not to seal me, but to become me. And Enki, the god once called the bringer of light, faced the harshest truth of all. He had nothing left to offer but himself. Enki slumped in the damp dark, sweat and tears slick on his face like he'd just crawled up from the ocean floor. But no water could wash away the truth Atlantis had crammed into him. It didn't wait for him to accept. It didn't need his permission. Atlantis only needed him to remember. And when he opened his eyes, a flood of images hit without needing any real wave to sweep him away. He saw cities rising on cracked earth, stone towers sharp as fangs, Emi glyphs carved deep above city gates. not the language of understanding anymore, but of command. Inside, the strong read the words to rule, the weak bowed to sign slave contracts. Enki tried to turn away, but his neck felt shackled. Atlantis rumbled low. Look! The scene shifted. An army marched across the desert, banners whipping in the hot wind, soldiers chanting lines lifted from Emmy tablets, promises of order that delivered only death. He watched blood soak into the sand, staining the warped words red. Enki ground his teeth so hard he tasted blood anyway. Atlantis whispered, "This is the vow you didn't keep." Then darker images came. Humans drilling into the ocean floor, machines screaming, searchlights stabbing through ink-black water. Diver masks gleamed as beams fell on Atlantis's cracked crystal towers, exposing the glowing Emmy glyphs. Engines roared like a hunted beast's heartbeat. And in that vision, Enki heard the screams of souls who'd never learned freedom, only obedience. Atlantis was cold, factual. They will find me. They will open me. He wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat like a boulder. Atlantis didn't need to debate. It only showed the truth. The final image was a slow knife twist. Leaders in a sealed room, a Emmy tablet resting in the center of the table. Their eyes were greedy but afraid. One man reached out, fingers brushing the glyphs, mouthing the old oath. But the words were twisted, mocking. Atlantis repeated that voice exactly, like some mocking talking beast. "I swear to protect, at any cost." Enki sobbed. He saw himself in that man. Same terrified eyes at the thought of losing power. Same pleading voice begging knowledge for salvation, but only to build a new cage. Atlantis whispered, almost laughing, "If you don't give me your memory, I will find someone else." And he understood. The seal didn't exist because of stone or water. It existed because the one holding it dared to carry the memory like blood in his heart. If he refused, Atlantis wouldn't die. It would wait. And it would find another, someone more ambitious, more fragile, ready to fling the door open without ever knowing the cost. In the dark, Enki heard the distant, slow, old man rhythm of waves crashing, steady as a dying heartbeat. And he knew it wasn't if, only when. Atlantis had planted its seed in his blood, and that seed would grow. Even if it had to kill him to break through. Enki leaned against the cold stone wall, breath heavy as if 1,000 years of rock pressed against his chest. In the damp darkness, Atlantis was silent. No more accusations, no more promises. Just a waiting that felt thick as mud settling at the bottom of a lake. He lifted his face, drew a deep breath, trying to find some scrap of courage left inside. But no light answered, only the chill darkness, more patient than time itself. Atlantis didn't need to say anything else. It knew he'd heard enough. And that silence was worse. Like a verdict that didn't need to be spoken, because it was already carved into his bones. Enki closed his eyes. In his head he heard distant waves hitting the shore, slow and steady like the heartbeat of some old animal waiting to die. He asked himself, "What if I refuse?" The question echoed dry and brittle. There was no answer, but he knew it anyway. Atlantis didn't need his consent. It only needed him to understand. If he didn't go down into its depths, if he didn't willingly open himself, and hand over his memories, it would find someone else. Someone who would open the gate not out of duty, but out of hunger. Atlantis would still be opened, but at the cost of blood, fire, and chains. Enki shuddered, his hand sliding along the stone, feeling the damp chill soak into his skin. He wanted to let go, to run. But run where? Atlantis wasn't just under the water. It was in the blood, in dreams, in the memories of the humanity he'd helped create, in himself. There was no shore safe from its tide, no night long enough to hide from Atlantis's eyes. Wind from the sea crept into the cave, carrying the raw salt smell and the stench of rotting kelp. Enki trembled, but he didn't step back. He understood. The journey back to Atlantis wasn't about opening or sealing anymore. It wasn't a choice. It was duty. A seal couldn't be just a spell. It had to be a person, a will, an oath made living. Enki bit his lip until it bled. Atlantis didn't laugh. It didn't need to win. It only needed him to remember. And he remembered everything. Every ME tablet he ever wrote, every promise he ever made, every memory he tried to bury. Atlantis demanded all of it. And to keep it buried, he'd have to become the tomb himself. No more stone seals, no more vibrating glyphs, only Enki, willing to lock himself away forever with the knowledge he once tried to hide. In the darkness, he opened his eyes. Cold, heavy, but clear. Atlantis waited, and Enki let out a weary breath, no longer denying it, because the sea would keep singing until he returned. Not to open the gate, but to become it himself. Enki rose slowly, sand and grit falling from his sweat-soaked cloak. He wasn't trembling anymore, exhausted like parched earth after a heavy rain, but steady. Cold wind threaded through the cave like the world's final whisper from outside. But he heard nothing except the steady echo of a decision rooting itself deep in his heart. Atlantis was silent, but its silence had changed. It was no longer a threat. It was waiting. He moved forward, hands sliding along the damp rock, leaving a faint smear like liquid emiglyphs. Each step felt like driving an unspoken vow into the ground. Old memories rose unbidden in his mind. He remembered the first time he'd stood before Atlantis's gate as it opened. Water twisting into spirals, blue light glowing from the deep like the eyes of an ancient being. He'd spoken the sealing words then, but they had been half-lies. He gave up some memories but kept his fear. Laid down some guilt, but hid his pride. Atlantis accepted it then. But it remembered, and now it demanded the rest. Enki paused in the dark tunnel, his hand pressed against the rock wall, which breathed like a living thing. Glyphs glimmered faintly in the wet moss, flickering like sickly fireflies. Atlantis didn't laugh, didn't rage. It just waited. He swallowed a shaky breath. His voice rasped out, dry as wind scraping through a hollow. I will return. The words echoed flat and empty, but Atlantis heard, and it answered with silence, heavy as a vow carved in bone. He shut his eyes and saw the old rituals, his hand sketching symbols in water, reciting syllables that vibrated like plucked strings. But now he understood. No formula would hold Atlantis unless he put all of himself into it. No sealing with words, only with blood, with whole, unbroken memory. Atlantis didn't want a promise anymore. Atlantis wanted him to be the promise. Enki opened his eyes, staring into the darkness as if into the ocean's abyss. He saw twisting spirals of water, the eyes of ancient guardians. Silent Naga, watchful Apkallu. They didn't block him. They didn't guide him. They only bore witness. Atlantis whispered softly. No command, just truth. If you are not the seal, no one will be. His heart beat slow and heavy. He took a long breath, pulling in the salt, the moss, the old metallic tang of blood. Atlantis didn't rush him. It let him choose, and he nodded, though no one saw. In the dark, he whispered the final words of the rite he'd choked back 1,000 years before. I give everything. Far off, the waves lapped gently at the rocks, like a rhythm punctuating the vow carved into bone. Atlantis didn't roar anymore. There was only the sound of his heartbeat, and it waited. Enki turned, leaving the cave, eyes fixed on the dim, dark sea outside, where the deepest place beneath the waves wasn't just waiting, but breathing. Enki stepped out of the dark cave, his feet meeting the cold stones still wet with night mist. Before him stretched the sea, endless and black as memories that refused the light. The waves no longer roared in anger. They simply breathed, a breath older than any language. Atlantis didn't call, didn't command. It simply opened, silent, like a dark well waiting for the thirsty to look in on their own. Enki stood still, the sea wind catching his mud-stained cloak, making it flutter like ash. He drew a deep breath, the briny, rank smell of seaweed filling his lungs. Inside his mind, all the old whispers had fallen away. There was only one sound left, low and steady, syncing with his heartbeat, waiting. Atlantis no longer needed to threaten. It knew he understood. He looked at the water, glinting with the last dying starlight on the horizon. But Enki no longer saw the surface. His gaze cut through the waves, down into the depths where light couldn't reach. There, Atlantis shifted, not fully awake, not fully asleep, a being made of buried memory. He whispered, voice cracked but firm, I will return. Atlantis didn't answer, but the water moved, small waves sliding up the rocks to chill his feet. Enki closed his eyes. He heard it all again, the ancient vow he'd spoken when sealing Atlantis with me tablets, the screams of abandoned souls drowning in the flood, the mocking laughter of rulers who read me as commands to enslave. All of it was him. No more denying, no more splitting it up. His voice dropped to a near prayer. I won't hide it anymore. I won't break it up. I'll carry all of it. The wind quieted as if to listen. Atlantis didn't force him to kneel. He bowed on his own, his hand clenched in the folds of his cloak, binding himself with invisible chains. In his heart there was no more hope for stone seals, no old ritual to save him, just one raw truth. To bury Atlantis, he would have to bury himself. He opened his eyes, looking at the dark sea, like staring into the giant eye socket of an ancient god. No more fear, No more pride, only exhaustion and agreement. Atlantis didn't laugh. It didn't win. It simply accepted. The waves beat slow and steady like a timeless heart, never hurried, never dying. Enki took one step toward the sea. The cold water closed around his feet, but he didn't back away. He inhaled deeply, lungs filling with salt and mist, and he knew the journey wasn't to find Atlantis and seal it again. It was to become the final living seal for the memories he'd sown. Ahead, the sea promised nothing, offered no comfort, but it opened. And Enki, the one they once called bringer of light, lowered his head and accepted the dark.